Okay. Oh gosh, it's great. Okay, and there we are. I'm trying to get you to this. There we are. Today we're going to talk about mostly Florence, of course, and Botticelli. And you know, we mostly know Botticelli for this painting, The Birth of Venus, or the Spring, La Primavera. But in fact, he has a very large body of work, even though he's thought of having burned some of the works during the period of Savonarola. But even there are some debates to know if it's correct or not. So before I go on into the subject, I'll give you a little bit of historical background. It's, in this case, is extremely important. I bring you back that genealogy of the Medici family that starts with Cosimo, who is the son of Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. Cosimo, who is the elder who started the bank, was a rather effaced type of person. He wasn't putting himself ahead, but was very efficient on the other side. We have to remember that he had a brother whose name was Lorenzo, and who is going to stay on the side, except he's instrumental in bringing some other figures that we're going to talk about, who are Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco and Giovanni di Pierfrancesco, both sons of Pierfrancesco the Elder. We'll see later on how they play quite a role with Botticelli. Cosimo is going to have many children, the most important being Piero I de' Medici, who's going to succeed him. Is going to marry Lucrezia Tornabuoni, and Giovanni de' Medici, who is the other son. Piero is going to have many children, who is going to marry pretty well. As you can see, they married the Pazzi family into the Uccellai family. And Lorenzo the Magnificent is the one that is ruling during the time we're going to talk about, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was born in 1449 and died in 1492. He will marry a couple of times, but his first wife is going to give him many children. His brother was Giuliano de' Medici, who is going to be assassinated in 1478, and was the father of Giovanni di Giuliano de' Medici. As you can see, as the names are repeated, they always use the name of the father to make sure which one we're talking about. And Giovanni di Giuliano de' Medici will become Pope Clement VII later on. Lorenzo heir to the ruling of the Medici family is Piero II, called the Unfortunate. He's only going to reign, if not reign because he's not a king, but he's going to be the leader only for about 5 years, and then will be ousted from Florence. And we'll see the following adventures later on. So in detail, the Medicis, in 1298, I go back into Siena, and when Siena was at that time one of the banking centers in Italy, and the Bonsignoris of Siena will go bankrupt in 1298, which is going to open the door to the people from Florence, the families from Florence. Following in the 14th century and 15th century, the family that is the most influential in Florence is the Albizzi family. And then finally, between 1360 and 1429, we have Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici that founded the Medici Bank, was himself owning 2 wool workshops in Florence. They were members of 2 guilds, the Arte della Lana and the Arte del Cambio. A again, there we see favors that are given. We see that Giovanni is going to get rewarded by Pope Martin V because he was supporting the Pope. And so he gives him the control of the Apostolic Chamber and multiple favors, secure tax farming contracts, and the right to many alum mines. And you might wonder what alum mines means, but these were products that were very important into the dyeing of the wool and for other purposes. And it was a very rare type of ore to find. And so having having all the rights on the mines were extremely important. From 1397 to 1494, the Medici Bank is the most important bank in Europe. It will work on improving the general ledger system through the development of double entry system of tracking debits and credits or deposits and withdrawals. They had branches in Rome, Geneva, Venice, and Naples, and offices in London, Pisa, Avignon, Bruges, Milan, and Lubeck. So that gives you an idea how widespread the bank was, and actually was making most of its money from these branches, far more than what they had in Florence, which at times was going through a lot of economic problems. In 1389, all the way to in 1464, Cosimo de' Medici the Elder became the unofficial head of state after his return from exile in 1434. He had been sent into exile to Venice. And when the economy of Florence went down the drain while he was gone, because he had taken all his business with him. And so they called on him to come back, and he came back in 1434, and that gave him much more power. He was a patron of the arts with Michelangelo, the architect, Brunelleschi, architect and goldsmith, Benozzo Gozzoli, the painter, Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi, Donatello, all you know. In 1433, while he was in Venice, he commissioned a library as a gesture of gratitude. And when he came back to Florence, he was very interested in founding a library, which he did in 44, founding the first public library in Florence. Here is the Giovanni de' Medici. This is Cosimo. So Piero de' Medici was called the Gouty because he was suffering from gout, and that really handicapped him. He was only in power for 4 years until 1469, and was succeeded by his son Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo de' Medici was a formidable figure. He didn't live that long. He was born in 1449, died in 1492. Was tutored by Gentile de' Becchi, a diplomat and bishop, and Marsilio Ficino, who was a humanist philosopher who will found a Neoplatonic university in Florence. He was a very physical guy. He practiced jousting, hawking, hunting, and horse breeding for the Palio in Siena, where they would compete. But was from very young on sent on important diplomatic missions, including trips to Rome, to the Vatican. In 1478 happened the Pazzi conspiracy. The Pazzis were conspiring against the Medici for power. They actually attacked them while they were in the service in the cathedral. And unfortunately, his brother Giovanni was killed, whereas Lorenzo was wounded and was able to flee before being killed. The wrath of Lorenzo was terrible, and they really went in a campaign in Florence to find people that had participated into that conspiracies, and they were tortured and killed, including of course, the Pazzi themselves and the Salviati also. Though the Pazzi and the Salviati at that time had the support of the Holy See, which means the Vatican, and the Holy See wasn't happy with what happened. So they got really angry at Lorenzo, seized the Medici's assets, and excommunicated Lorenzo, put the Florentine city-state under interdict. And that means that they couldn't receive the sacraments. All the churches had to be closed. They couldn't be baptized, nothing at all. Between 1478 and 1480, the Pope will ally himself with Naples against Lorenzo, who will be made prisoner in Naples, but then was able in 1480 to be released, and that strengthened his position in Florence. He was also a great protector of the arts with Piero and Antonio del Pollaiuolo, Andrea del Verrocchio, Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Michelangelo Buonarroti. His son, Piero the Unfortunate, as he's called, was in power until he was exiled in 1494, so after the death in 92. So he was only in power for 2 years. And we have to wait all the way until 1512 for the return of the Medicis to Florence. And that's going to be through a signed branch of the family. Here's the picture of Lorenzo the Medici and the one of Piero. Here's the timeline. I keep two figures because they're such basic figures that really were referred to constantly by other artists later on. We're talking about Donatello and Masaccio. But then we have Fra Filippo Lippi, who really, despite the fact of being a monk, as we know, had to finally left the convent because he was in love with a nun. And they had that infamous affair from which they're going to have a son who's going to be Filippino Lippi that we'll see today. But Fra Filippo Lippi had a lot of followers and really created a workshop that was very successful. Together with Antonio del Pollaiuolo, the elder brother of Piero, these were the two main workshops in Florence in the mid 1400s, sorry. Antonio del Pollaiuolo, not only a painter, but also a sculptor. His brother Piero Younger, who worked and followed him for a while, but also worked closely with Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli, who studied under Fra Filippo Lippi in his early works, is going to be very similar to Filippo Lippi until he departs from his style. And then we have Filippino Lippi, the son from Fra Filippo Lippi, who is going to study with Sandro Botticelli also, and be acquainted with Piero del Pollaiuolo. I put as a reference Leonardo da Vinci, who we will see next in the first Tuesday of October. He will be the student of Verrocchio, who we will see at that time too. And then Michelangelo, who comes in the 1480, who is going to study with Ghirlandaio. And then I put Lorenzo de' Medici, so you have an idea that he would be ruling about from this period to there and knew all of these painters. The Medici lived in the Medici Palace that had been built by Michelozzo between 1445 and 1460, the very typical facade with the rough stone at on the ground floor, and then the three different orders, as how that looks like stability, strength, and is a little bit portrayed like the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. The courtyard, the center of the house, is really important because this is where all the sculptures that they commissioned were displayed. Around the court that the Medici created in Florence were a lot of mines, really important mines. And I'm listing them. This is part of a painting that shows the portraits of at least 4 of the 5. On the very left, we have Marsilio Ficino, who was an Italian scholar, a Catholic priest, but was the most influential humanist philosopher of the early Renaissance. He was also an astrologer and particularly known for being a reviver of Neoplatonism. He was the first translator of Plato's complete extant work into Latin. In his Florentine academy, he really tried to revive Plato's academy and really was instrumental in influencing the direction of the Italian Renaissance and literally the development of European philosophy. The second one is Cristoforo Landino, that you see again with the face turning towards us, was humanist, also a prolific writer, and he championed the use of vernacular Italian, was of course a member also of the Platonic Academy, and was one of the tutors of Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. The third figure, also extremely important, is Angelo Policiano. He was a classical scholar and a poet, was also instrumental in the divergence from the Renaissance Latin from medieval norms, which means the medieval Latin had evolved a certain way and had corrupted the original Latin. And he tried to bring back the language to its purity, if you want. He was looking at Cicero for prose and Virgil for poetry. He did a lot of translation, the Homer's Iliad, and then edited the poetry of Catullus, etc. Became tutor to the children of the Medici, and then became quite a close friend and political confidant also. His great friend, and he's not on this picture but needs to be mentioned, is Pico della Mirandola, who was, though despite his very young age, a great scholar on the ideas of Plato. But he wanted also to reconcile some of the ideas of Plato with Aristotle. He actually worked against some of the exaggeration of pure humanism and believed that some of the ideas that existed prior to that were the medieval and Islamic commentators such as Averroes and Avicena in Spain on Aristotle. And he thought that we shouldn't dismiss what they had said at that time. He died very young, in his early 30s. And then the last figure on the right, we have some doubts. It could be Gentile de Becchi or Demetrios Chalcondyles, sorry for that. De Becchi was also a prominent member of the Medici Academy, was a poet, theologian, and orator, was a tutor of the second son of Lorenzo, Giovanni de' Medici, who, by the way, became Pope Leo X, who succeeded to Julius II. Demetrios Chalcondyles is an interesting person. He was the last of the Greek humanists who taught Greek literature at the great university around northern Italy. Just a little sideline that is always interesting. He married in 1484 at the age of 61 and fathered 10 children. Finally, he was invited by Ludovico Sforza and moved to Milan in 1491 and 92, where he taught until he died. This is just to give you an idea again of that incredible strength of the intellect in Florence at the time. The Villa di Careggi that had been reconstructed by Michelangelo was the place where Lorenzo the Medici will die. But this was the typical, one of the many villas of the Medici around Florence. Looked a little bit like a stronghold when you see it, but had the character of the castello. If you look at the upper floor, it's very similar to what you find in the upper floor of the palace in Florence. The garden was quite interesting. It was a medieval garden that was kind of a little bit lower than the villa, and had all the herbs and all the characteristic of what you find in medieval gardens. Marsilio Ficino will die in that villa also, and Lorenzo died there in 1492. Lorenzo, that was, you know, they had commissioned the new sacristy from the decoration, at least, from Michelangelo. And normally the tomb of Lorenzo was supposed to be part of it, but the times changed, and when all the exile happens and so on, finally, Lorenzo wasn't buried in there. These are two secondary members of the Medici family, but actually Lorenzo is buried behind these figures on the side wall, behind the Virgin by Michelangelo, and then flanked by Saint Cosmas and Damian. Cosmas standing for Cosimo, of course, who were the patron saint of the first of the Medici's lineage. And so it's behind there, there's just a little stone that shows where Lorenzo is buried. So let's look at the art that existed when Botticelli came upon the scene. Of course, we have Fra Filippo Lippi. This is probably one of his most famous work, one of my favorite, I have to admit. But this gives you a sense of that beautiful incisiveness of his lines. He is absolutely wonderful. By that time, he has totally mastered the perspective and gives you a real sense of these figures that are popping out of the frame as it shows. You have the Virgin is very pensive, of course. She knows that the child she has in front of him, who is there supported by some smiling angels, is going to suffer a terrible death. And so this, she cannot prevent from thinking about it. The figure here is most probably Filippino Lippi, the son of Fra Filippo Lippi, who is looking at us with a big, big smile. The other figure that exists at that time is Verrocchio. Verrocchio, whose reputation was already widespread in the second half of the 15th century. We will see him more in detail at the next class. And you see an inheritance of Fra Filippo Lippi, but with his very own style. Verrocchio is also a sculptor, and maybe that's what you can feel in this Madonna We Seat a Child. Ghirlandaio, who is going to have in his workshop Michelangelo for 3 years, here shows in this Adoration of the Shepherd a great tribute to actually Flemish painting. If you look at the group of the three shepherds on the right, they are a direct result of the arrival of the Hugo van der Goes great masterpiece called now the Portinary Altarpiece. This revolutionized the way Italian and Florentine painters in particular looked at things, where they departed from the pure idealized figures but from then on represented the shepherds as real people, you know, that were living a hard life and were not idealized anymore, though Ghirlandaio portrays himself here with the men turning the head. And then Piero del Polaiuolo, the younger brother of Antonio, who is going to work for a little while, very much in parallel with Botticelli. In this particular painting showing the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, we can see the saint unusually put up on a tree, if you want, with archers hitting him with the arrows. But you can see the interest of Polaiuolo in the movement of the figures down below, because if you see the archers, this one almost facing us is actually the same body that we see from the back there. This one that is leaning forward is almost the same body as that one turned towards us in the same movement. And then these two are also almost mirror images. They were still experimenting in all the movements and the anatomy of the figures. This was a particular study by the Polaiuolo brothers. And here's another work by him of the coronation of the Virgin. Both our brothers were sculptors as well. And we can see here how we can at times really put a parallel between Botticelli and Piero del Polaiuolo, that kind of elongated figures, very much idealized. So let's look at Sandro Botticelli. We see a self-portrait of him. He seemed to be a young, arrogant man. He was born in Florence as Alessandro di Moriano Filippetti. Around age 13, he started to train with Fra Filippo Lippi, and maybe also with Verrocchio. We have no proof of that, but some of his early works would show an influence. Around 1470, we can see that he worked with and was quite influenced by the Polaiuoli brother. In 1481-82, he will be asked to finish the frescoes. No, sorry, he was called to Rome and to participate into a program of frescoes in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. And we're talking about the large frescoes on the sides of the chapel, together with Perugino, Signorelli, and other really famous painters of the time. This was actually to try to resolve the problem Florence had with the papacy. Between 1480 and 1500, he really had created a very large workshop, producing mostly Madonnas. But after 1500, because tastes change, and we have to keep that in mind, is just as we see now, you know, what we loved when we were children or adolescent is not at all approved on by young people now. So maybe some music is, but the taste changed. And in art, it was the case. He was pretty famous, though he was not the most famous person in Florence, but he was one of the maybe 5 or 6 great figures in Florence at the time. But after 1500, the taste changed. Leonardo had created things that were very different. Michelangelo was on the scene. And so he suffered a decline in popularity, and he died in Florence in 1510. Unfortunately, very poor. He was apparently handicapped physically, had to walk with 2 canes, and totally impoverished at that time that his heir had to refuse his inheritance because he had so many debts. What is characteristic of Sandro Botticelli is his visual poetry that is definitely influenced by the Neoplatonist ideas and definitely by the text of, for example, Marsilio Ficino and Policiano also. But on the other hand, he doesn't follow some of the precepts of the Neoplatonist idea about perspective or anatomy. He will depart from that greatly, and we know that. Just to show you how powerful the influence of Fra Filippo Lippi was on him. This is Sandro Botticelli, the Madonna and Child with an Angel. And we there find right away the inspiration for that painting that was done a couple of decades before that by Fra Filippo Lippi. So the same composition, though he is not using a landscape in the back, but most of the position of the bodies and the action is very similar. His first applauded work is that Madonna of the Magnificat. It's probably his most famous picture of the Virgin at that time. We know that because there are 5 contemporary replicas that were made, and that tells you right away how successful it was. The tondo, the format of the tondo, which means that round painting, was a very successful form, if you want, at that time. People would use that, and these round paintings were set above the doors, very typically. In this case, the Virgin is crowned by 2 angels, and she's depicted as the Queen of Heaven. The crown itself is kind of a very delicate piece of goldsmith's work, and is made of a whole series of little stars that are an allusion to what is called the Stella Matutina, the morning star, which was one of the mothers of God's name in the contemporary hymns devoted to Mary. So to respect that round shape, the painter had really to adapt his composition to have these rounded edges, and he's really working extremely well to it. And then in the background, we still have a lovely landscape that goes by the rules of the atmospheric perspective, which means it's not going, the perspective is marked by a change of colors at a distance. As when we look outside, look at the horizon, we know that they are more blues and then greens and so on, that give us an idea of the perspective. The 3 angels that are at the front have moved towards the Virgin and Child, and one is kneeling and holding an open book and an inkwell. He is encouraged by the child to dip her quill and write the last words of the Magnificat, and you can see the word here, Magnificat. The Virgin is again pretty melancholic for the same reason we are talking about. If you can see in her left hand, she's holding a pomegranate that has to do, is a symbol of the Passion. The idea of a landscape is new to Italy, and these are, again, and we'll hear a lot about it, but this is due to the influence of Flemish painters such as Jan van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden, and Hugo van der Goes. Definitely, a lot of their paintings had come into the collections of the big rulers, such in Urbino, in Florence, and many other places, in Mantua. We know that there were many Flemish paintings that were part of the collections, and the painters were looking at them. The Italian painters just loved the detailed execution of the pictorial motifs and the kind of very realistic making of the figures. This is the costliest tondo that Botticelli ever created. The reason is a lot of gold, and that's due to the the patron who was providing so much gold. So if you look at it, you can see that's real gold leaf. This is not painting that is used for the ornamentation of the dress, the divine rays, Mary's crown, and even the highlight in her hair. A detail of the angels. And there you can already start seeing the works of Botticelli. The Virgin and Child enthroned. This is the Bardi altarpiece. So the Bardi family commissioned that work. The Virgin and Child are surrounded by John the Baptist and John the Evangelist. Typically, John the Baptist shown in a very simple garb, whereas the Evangelist is shown with a book in his hand, just noting him as the writer. The work was commissioned by Giovanni de Bardi, who was nicknamed the Great English Merchant because he had spent quite a bit of time in London, where he was directing the London branch of the Medici Bank. So when Bardi returned to Florence, he commissioned this work for his chapel in the Santo Spirito. And this was typically to help for his spiritual salvation. Unfortunately, the original frame was destroyed, as often happened. The Virgin is portrayed as the Madonna lactans, which means she's opening her dress to allow her child to be nursed. So what the original side of this is, instead of having a triptych or the saints put in niches as they used to be, Botticelli forms kind of a vegetation niche for each of the saints and for the Virgin herself. Here you can see the detail of the Virgin, who is really starting, though the fingers, when you look at the lengths of her fingers, it reminds me of Crivelli. Botticelli is going to make many different parts of the life of the Virgin, and including the Annunciation. And it's always interesting to compare these works and see the evolution of the painter in similar themes. So he is an early, on the left, the Botticelli the Annunciation of 1485. That really shows how Botticelli is moving on. Very classical architecture. He's, of course, using the architecture as well as the floors to enhance the perspective. The Virgin and the angels are almost mirror images of one another. And they're just separated by these pillars that are going towards the vanishing point. It's, though, quite different to the other one that was painted only 4 years later, the Cestello Annunciation. This was painted for the church of Florentine convent of Cestello, which is today Santa Maria Maddalena de Pazzi. The architecture is almost ignored by them, but we have that great opening towards the landscape, again, definitely influence of Flemish painters. And the dynamics between the angels and the Virgin is completely different. And to me, it reminds me a little bit of Annunciation by Donatello, where the Virgin has also that movement where she almost wants to push away the angel because she's so concerned of what happens. And I put the words on top here. might be obscured somewhat, is the Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Comes from St. Luke's Gospel and describes the words of the angel in a beautiful Renaissance frame, by the way. Let's compare that with Fra Filippo Lippi Annunciation. We can see also there some influence of Fra Filippo Lippi in his 1445 Annunciation, where we also have that movement where the Virgin is kind of moving away from the angel. Just as we've seen many Annunciation, and we'll see some more, Botticelli did many times use the theme of adoration of the Magi. And we'll see there also how his mastering of the crowd that surrounds these scenes is going to evolve dramatically. So in a very early painting in 1465 to 67, that adoration of the Magi here shows a kind of a confused scene. The Virgin and Joseph and the child are on the right. We have the procession of the Magi coming, but then just a confusion on the very left, where the right side is pretty bare almost. The left side is very crowded. Compared to the painting he did almost 10 years later with the adoration of the Magi in the Tondo form, we see the evolution of his handling of the subject. In doing what he's doing, he's following very much the advices of Alberti, who had written De Pictura, which means a book about painting, where he gives a lot of advices to painters. And here, the idea that he wanted to, Alberti was advising to embrace the greatest possible diversity for the edification of the observer. So he brings again the whole retinue of the Magi's. The Magi's are there, but now we have a great architecture that shows kind of a ruined temple. The Virgin is in the center holding the child and offering the child to the adoration of the Magi. Very different now are those that arrived just 5 years later than the one we just saw. In this adoration of the Magi, sorry, this is really what established his fame in Florence, because now his style has matured. He has shed away things that were not necessary. The architecture holds on much better together. And he's, I think, giving a better balance to the crowd that surrounds the scene. He actually includes himself. This is where the self-portrait we saw at the beginning comes from. He's also there, he's included the most famous member of the Medici family. We have Cosimo the Elder as the elder king. And then we have Piero the Gouty and Lorenzo the Magnificent, who we can recognize very easily there. Sorry, he's there. What am I saying? And then the whole series, there are other portraits in there that would have been recognized at the time. Another 6 years later, we see another of his adoration of the Magi made in 1481. This is a painting he probably still made while he was in Rome doing the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. We can see an influence on the architectural background, and also the fact there are some interesting figures, as this little figure we have there of a lad trying to hold the horse. This corresponds to some of the classical sculpture he had seen in Rome, the Dioscuri, the horse tamers. Now the Virgin is very much again the focus of the painting with the child. At that time, Alberti again, his treatises come that for the edification of the observer, not only the greatest variation in the possible palette of emotions, but also the depiction of people of different ages, together with alternation in the perspectives offered by the figures, who should be presented from various sides in 3/4 and half profiles or from the front. So these were really treatises that were written and that were followed by many of the painters. The paintings of the mythological paintings made by Botticelli, that are probably the most known of his works, were actually hanging in the villa that you see here, which is the Villa di Castello. This is a villa which is at the foot of the hills, northwest of Florence, near the town of Sesto Fiorentino. It was located near a Roman aqueduct that was bringing the water to the side. It was purchased in 1477 by Lorenzo and his brother Giovanni di Pier Francesco de' Medici. That's the year that their father died at the age of 46. And they became the wards of their cousin Lorenzo the Magnificent. They reconstructed the old building, added a courtyard, a loggia, kitchens, and stables. Later, the house was inherited by Giovanni dalle Bande Nere, who was actually a mercenary soldier, condottiere, and his wife Maria Salviati, who comes from that family that was pursued by Lorenzo. But they will be the members of the family that from which Cosimo de' Medici is going to come later on, so in the next century. So this is the way the villa went on. The villa, as you can see, even nowadays, was known for its collection of dwarf citrus tree, particularly lemon trees, that really gave the fashion around Europe during the mid-15th century to have these little trees that then were taken inside during the winter. It is in that villa, though we know also that the paintings for a while hung into the palace in Florence, but it is particularly there that the famous Primavera made in 1482 by Botticelli hang. And we have that beautiful image of the central figure of what can be considered the spring that can also be understood as a Christian virgin. Around her, we have the classic groups of the three graces on the left. And then on the right, we have the figure of, so I'm going to bring this. So we have Venus, but that can be considered as a virgin. Cupid on top with his bow and arrow. The three graces that are definitely influenced by classical sculpture. Mercury, Hermes, who is looking at the oranges. He's the guardian of the garden. And the oranges have to do with the Medici, Mela Medici, which is part of the coat of arms of the Medici. Then on the other side, we have Zephyr, who is pursuing Chloris, who is going to be turned into Flora. That's also part of the Ovid writings. So what is quite interesting is that we have very little interaction between the groups. They kind of lined up next to one another. Very typical of the mature art of Botticelli is the elongated figures, elongated proportion, very small limbs, small feet, small ankles, very sensuous costume. And then the landscape is almost like a millefiori tapestry. So Venus is standing in the center of the picture. She's set back from the other figures and is hallowed by what you can see here, that very large hallowed of the laurel bush, which is actually the lauro in Italian would be a homophonic reference to Lorenzo. Above her, we have the Cupid that is aiming one of his arrows of love at the three graces. These are dancing in the roundel with their fingers intertwined. The garden of the goddess of love is guarded by Mercury. He is lightly clad with a red cloak covered with flames. He is wearing the helmet, typically carries a sword that clearly characterizes him as the guardian of the garden. Zephyr, who is the god of the winds, is forcefully pushing his way in pursuit of the nymph Chloris, who is going to be transformed into Flora, the goddess of spring, who is then, as you can see, very beautifully scattering roses, the flowers of the goddess of love. What is interesting, if you look, is that the crows of the two women are being blown in different directions, where we have the wind blowing Chloris's crows towards the left, the crows of Flora are blowing and flowing to the right. Lots of interpretation of that scene. One of the sources of the scene is Ovid's Fasti, which is a poetic calendar describing Roman festival. For the month of May, Flora tells how she was once the nymph Chloris and breathes out the flowers. But we also have quite a description in the poem De Rerum Natura of the classical writer Lucretius, who celebrated both the goddesses in a single spring scene. In that passage that really seems to be literally what Botticelli painted, is springtime and Venus come, and Venus, boy, the winged harbinger, steps on before, and hard on Zephyr's footprints, Mother Flora, sprinkling the ways before them, filled all with colors and with odors excellent. So some people see a lot of secrets. They look at the transformation of Chloris into Flora. So I see lots of questions, but I will add during the intermission. The patrons definitely seems to be the two sons of Pier Francesco. They work very closely with Botticelli, and this seems to have been commissioned by them. The Mala Medica, as I mentioned, which was the name of the orange and the scientific name, is directly linked to Medica, the Medici, who made believe people that their ancestors were doctors, Medici. The other great figure of the mythological series by Botticelli is also linked to that villa that I showed you before. The storyline, though, is not the moment of the goddess birth. In fact, it's the moment where she comes ashore. The story goes that, and this comes from the poet Hesiod, that she rose from the foaming sea after Cronus cut off his father's Uranus genitals and threw it in the ocean. And so what we see is not her coming out of the ocean, but gliding gently to the shore. Again, there is a description that goes back to Poliziano, one of the humanists we talked about, that in one of his epic poems, Stanze per la Giostra, describes Venus as being driven towards the shore on a shell by Zephyr, and how an onlooker would have seen the flash in the goddess's eye and the horrors of the season standing on the shores in white garments, their flowing hair caressed by the wind. So the god of the wind, Zephyr, that you can see on the left, is holding in his arms our harp, and they're gently driving Venus towards the shore with their breath. She is standing naked on a golden shining shell, and comes to the shore with these rippling waves. Their aura of spring is approaching her on the tips of her toes and is spreading out a magnificent cloak for her. So if we look at the style of Botticelli compared to what was done at the time, you can see it's a very graphic, almost design-only style. The waves are not there to mimic the sea, but are just there to suggest the sea. In many of the way he paints, the line is more important than the color. The grace of it, it's almost like a musical painting when you look at it. The goddess of love is represented there as what we call the Venus Fudica, where she's hiding her breast and her genitals with her hand. Very typical of that period of Botticelli, very shallow space. If you can look at the figures, they're not really on the ground, they are floating. There is also an interesting thing is that there are some strange stories about the legs. There is something that doesn't quite work with the legs of Zephyr. The Venus herself is not responding to the classical contrapposto. If you look at the way she's built, you could not stand the way she is. There is, normally she should have a straight leg to be able to give her some equilibrium. But in this fact, the vertical axe, if you want, is just next to the left leg, not on it. And so she couldn't possibly stand that way. Now, to the contrary of the Primavera, this one is painted on canvas, the other one was on board. And though they're supposed to have been painted for the same place, we know that they preferred canvas for works that were going to go into the countryside because of the biggest change in climate in the countryside. And canvas responded to that better than wood. Here's the Venus Fudica, very typical, showing that, and actually one was owned by the Medici at that time. Now, a lot has been said about the model for Primavera and the birth of Venus. There was a woman Simonetta Vespucci, who was nicknamed La Bella Simonetta, was born in 1453, was part of the Republic of Genoa, and was so beautiful that the Policiano wrote that in that stern Ligurian district above the seacoast, where angry Neptune beats against the rocks, there, like Venus, she was born among the waves. So she was known for her particular beauty. Her father was a Genoese nobleman, and she was married at the age of 16 to Marco Vespucci, who was a distant cousin of the explorer, Amerigo Vespucci. Their marriage took place in Florence, where the husband was in close relationship with the Medici, and they were given the privilege of holding the marriage in the palace and then the reception in one of their villas. They became very close. I think almost anybody that would see Simonetta fell in love with her, and there are a lot of stories saying that actually the Medici's brothers fell in love with her, but this remained a very platonic love. Unfortunately for her, that beautiful girl who seemed to have been the model not only for Botticelli but also for Piero de Cosimo. We'll see that in a month. Died the year after her marriage, died of tuberculosis. So a very rapid life. A few more of the mythological painting. He only, that we know, painted 4 of them. This is the Pallas and the Centaur. That was also displayed in the Florence City Palace, probably in the same room as the Primavera for the short period of time it was in Florence. It shows a centaur that has trespassed in forbidden territory. The centaur, typically half horse and half man, he is brought under control by a guard armed with a shield and a halberd. And that guard is a woman, really interesting. She's grabbing him by the hair. She's identified as either goddess Pallas Athena or the Amazon Camilla, who was a chaste heroine of Virgil's Aeneid. And this gives you the lesson of virtue is victorious over sensuality. Same thing again, we have these elongated forms, and the line is again more important than the colors or the modeling. Venus and Mars, amorous victory. We have again a beautiful woman in a myrtle tree. This is the tree of Venus, the goddess of love, who is clothed with a beautiful and very costly gown. She's watching the sleepy, naked Mars, while little fawns are having really fun with his weapons and his armor all around him. This is one of the first of the Renaissance paintings that shows these little boisterous kids. And this painting is going to mark the end of Botticelli's period with the Medici. After that, he is going to grow increasingly religious. And if we look at the date, we'll understand soon that the atmosphere in Florence is going to degrade, as well as we have a comeback of a very religious fervor. We will see that soon. Here's a detail of the little guys. And one is blowing the horn in the shell, into his ear. Doesn't seem to wake him up though. In the 1480s, Botticelli is going to gain some commission from families in high society, and they typically chose classical themes for beautiful decoration of their townhouse. So to be able to face all these commissions, Botticelli is going to have to work with other painters as well as members of his workshop. So in this case, for example, we have the contribution of Bartolomeo di Giovanni in this painting. The patron for this painting is Antonio Pucci, and he's going to order the 4 paintings that we'll see for the wedding of his son, Giannozzo to Lucrezia Bini. The story is part of Boccaccio's Decameron. So they originally decorated the room in the old Pucci Palace. Now, the first 2 paintings are really a description of the Boccaccio Decameron, but then we'll see that the other 2 are put into the context of the marriage itself. The story is pretty cruel. What the father is trying to tell him is really a lesson on marriage. So Nastagio degli Onesti, which is the name, is that knight from Ravenna whose beloved initially refused to marry him and finally weds her after all. So first of all, he must remind her of the eternal agony in heaven of another merciless woman who had also refused marriage. Her rejected lover had to pursue her until he had caught up with her, killed her, torn her heart and its intestines, and fed them to his dogs. And this is the scene you see there on the upper left. In the second episode, the woman has fallen, bitten by the dogs, wounded by the sword. The knight dismounts, cuts open her back, and rips out her heart to feed it to the dogs. The woman gets to her feet and starts running again. You can see that in the background. The horse and dog start the chase again, and at that time, degli Onesti realizes that he has witnessed a phantom hunt, a curse. The third and fourth scenes, in the third episode, what you see is nothing but phantoms, and again, witness the ghostly young woman's atrocious murder under the thrust and blows of her ghostly lover's sword before the panic-stricken participants of the picnic. The father of the bridegroom, Pucci, is portrayed on the third painting amidst the guests. So you can see him probably here. And then the fourth painting represents the woman saying sweetly, "In that case, I'll marry you." And we are present for the marriage of Donna Lucrezia Bini and Ugolino degli Onesti. So this is really kind of a strange way to convince a woman to marry you, I think. Around 1486, Sandro Botticelli is going to create 2 large frescoes in the loggia that are now in the Louvre. It's really interesting because he didn't do too much frescoes at first. He will have to, because when he goes to Rome, he will have to adapt his work to the frescoes. But it looks like it's almost a preparation for it. This celebrated the marriage between Lorenzo Tornabuoni and Giovanna di Masso degli Albizzi in 1486. This has been linked again very much to the philosophy of Neoplatonic Academy, in which the Tornabuoni were in very good relation with the Medicis. Unfortunately, these frescoes are in really poor state of preservation. They were damaged when they were taken off the wall. Somebody had asked me one day, how do they remove frescoes from the wall? It's a very, very delicate process and not always successful. And this is an example of failure. So the two that you see here are now in the Louvre, were finally transferred to canvas. It shows on the left the Venus and the three Graces presenting gifts to a young woman. The young woman is there. And you have here Venus and the three Graces. And on the other side, a young man being introduced to the seven liberal arts. So this is so much has so much to do with all the Neoplatonic ideas. So the villa, these were in the Villa Lemmi, by the way, that you see here, which was passed to the Tornabuoni in 1469, and then in 1541 passed to other owners. These frescoes were only rediscovered in 1873. They were concealed under all coats of paint for centuries. You see how, when the taste changed, then they cover it with plaster and forget about it. So how many treasures we have hidden in these houses is incredible. Other commissions came to Botticelli, and this is for the Guild of Doctors and Apothecaries, a very large pala, so it's an altarpiece, the Virgin and Child with 4 angels and 6 saints. In the saints, we can recognize St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Augustine, and St. Barnabas on the left. And on the right, we have St. John the Baptist, St. Ignatius, and St. Michael. This is in the same kind of style, if you want, that what you find in Venice at the time with the Bellini, St. Giovanni Bellini, but much not as modeled as Bellini would do. You have the Virgin on a throne up a few steps from the others with the shell on top of her, so very typically Renaissance, and angels who are holding the cross of honor that surmounts her. The painting had 7 panels of predella at the bottom. We'll see only what we still have. And then an interesting part of the painting is the fact on the steps of the throne, there is for the first time in the history of painting an inscription in a vernacular, in Italian, not in Latin, in Italian. And these lines come from the Dante's Divine Comedy, which shows that at that time already Botticelli was quite interested in the poetry of Dante. At the bottom of that painting were 7 predellas. Here are 4 of them. This is the only works that are left, showing Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist, Christ in the sepulchre, vision of St. Augustine, extraction of St. Ignatius' heart. And I'm going to take a very quick break right now before I start talking about the Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. So please, I'm going to answer the chats if there are some.
I lost the connection right as soon as you finished the history. I had missed
that's too bad.
All of the presentation.
So sorry, John, but you will have the recording as soon as they resolve the problem of how to do it, and people, you know, that people that pay for it can benefit from it, but not the people that haven't paid. So somebody is asking me, it's Cynthia, is asking me, the Medici were not nobility. They were not until the mid-16th century. Then they will become dukes. But at first, they are not. The Florence is a republic. And so everybody is supposed to be on the same step, which isn't the case, of course. Okay, very good remark from Jeffrey about Flora that could be pregnant. This is the way women were presented at that time. It was the fashion. They always had a little domed stomach. It had to do with, we assume pretty well actually, that it was to show the fact that the interest in a woman was the fact that she could produce heirs. And so it's the fertility idea that makes it, women in the north and in the south are always represented with a domed stomach. They're not pregnant, but they can be. What is the Apostolic Chamber? That's an organization that surrounded the Pope, and that had to do with some of the rules that were leading the Vatican at that time. What is the source of the wealth of whom? The Medici? Cynthia, you're around? I don't know. The source of their wealth was the banking. So they were, you know, lending money and getting interest on it. So that was the source of.
So you had to have a lot of money to start that, right?
Exactly. And they started small. When Cosimo started, they had business with wool, but they made good money, and they started realizing that people needed some loans. And so they loaned money and would get money in return, and often a lot of privileges.
So it was wool then. They were wool merchants.
They were wool merchants to start with.
Okay, interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I've run a little over what I needed to do. So I will have to really go on pretty quickly because otherwise we're not going to be able to make it. So,
and I don't understand, will I be able to access your audio?
Yes, when we have the recorded lectures, they are not posted from the beginning of September. All the others are posted on the site of the school with the audio. I give you access to two things normally. I give you access to my PowerPoint, which is without the audio, and then the school gives you the recording. And that's what you find when you go on the page. You click on program, and then you will see Anne Connor's recorded lectures. But for starting September, as you now pay for these talks, they have to find a way to give access to my recordings only to people that have paid for. Otherwise, some people are going to say, okay, we don't need to pay, we'll have access to her recording. So this is, so I'll let you know as soon as it's available. They're not available yet, but you will have them.
Merci.
My pleasure. Okay, so I'm going to mute you again. I see there's one more chat. Let me see. Doreen, my resident brother, I learned that Botticelli used the writing of Homer, not the writer you mentioned. Also a discrepancy in who was receiving Venus on the island. Okay, and that's just the question. It's not, the sources are not always unique. Sometimes they were using multiple sources, and definitely the contemporary humanists that were in Florence at that time, and there are lots of theories. So if you read one thing, believe me, there are about probably 20 others on the side, and they probably all partly right. So they definitely, Policiano and Ficino and so on would have had their word into how to present the things. So I hope this works. So now I'm going to mute you again. And we'll talk at the end. I have to now rush through a material that I love. So let's go on. So we mentioned the fact that Botticelli had a particular love for Dante, for the Divina Commedia. Here is a painting by Domenico da Michelino, a fresco in Santa Maria del Fiore that shows Dante showing the text of his Divine Comedy that is illuminating Florence. Divina Commedia was showing three particular chapters. Is of course, you have the Inferno, the Hell, Purgatory, Purgatorio, Purgatory, and Paradiso, Paradise. They all made of 33 and 34 canti. So these are all canti are part of the poetry of Dante. Literally, the way you will see is the fact that Dante comes to hell, is going to be taken through hell with some guides. And what you have is, you have Virgil, who is going to be next to him, as well as Beatrice, and then Thomas Aquinas. So, no, sorry, not Thomas Aquinas, what am I saying? Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. So Virgil represents human reason, Beatrice, the divine revelation, theology, faith, and grace. And Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is the contemplative mysticism and devotion to Mary. Dante was really the first one who described human beings as the product of a specific time, and within his description of Inferno, so he really places contemporary figures. So let's quickly move into, you can find lots of information on Dante. We know that in the early 1480, Botticelli started in some illustration of Dante's Inferno. We have the engraving work by Baccio Baldini of his figure of hell that is pretty frightening, but it was a typical representation. In the baptistry in Florence, we have this figure showing the devil ingesting some of the bad souls, and then he's rejecting them, as this one is too. But one of the most extraordinary work is in illustration of the Divine Comedy by Botticelli, that is part of a very large manuscript that has a tremendous story. I'm going to try to really summarize it, but I will advise you to go and look at Botticelli's Inferno, which is a documentary that has come out some years ago about the work of Botticelli, and you can get it on Amazon Prime. It costs you about $5. It lasts an hour and a half. And I think, though it's a little strange at times, it's quite informative. So the main work of Botticelli's illumination of that very large manuscript is that map of the Inferno that shows the abyss that was represented by Dante. The patron for the manuscript indicates that it's probably Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici who commissioned this work. The text was written by the copyist Niccolo Mangona, and the date of the commission is in the 1480s. We don't know exactly. For a reason that we don't know, the drawings were never completed. So the drawings exist for almost the entire text, but only 4 of the pages were colored. And so only 4 of the surviving 93 sheets, unfortunately 9 have been lost in the course of time. And they are shared between the Vatican Library and then the Staatliche Museum in Berlin. So here is that extraordinary view of the abyss of the Inferno, the different circles that are noted by Dante. And here you have the entrance of Dante on the Styx with his followers, as you can see. And there is the ship that's going to take him all around the different circles. Here's one of the details, and it's absolutely stunning to see where we see Dante and Virgil going around there and looking at how the bad souls, the poor souls, are treated by the devils. This was colored. You had first a drawing with silver point, and we'll see some of the ones that are not finished, and then was colored and absolutely extraordinary miniatures. Of course, Dante and Virgil that you see in multiple situations come out with the beautiful color of their gowns. Look at how detailed it is. And you see that page is in Berlin. And I will go through the story in a minute. Here is another view of the Inferno, only partly painted. And we don't know exactly why Botticelli had to stop at that time. This was a turbulent time. This is when Savonarola is going to come back. It's when the end of the life of Lorenzo. Botticelli had a lot of other works to do. And so he realized most probably that manuscript required so much work and wasn't bringing as much money as the paintings that he was doing. And here's another page of the Inferno. This is punishment of those who acted violently against God. All these, every page is normally facing the text that corresponds to it. The only page that is a double page is this one, and fortunately don't have much better image, but shows the Lucifer on 2 pages. And it shows actually his geographical position in hell. All the rest of the images, as you can see here with Purgatory 10 and Paradise, are just done with silver point and waiting to be colored. And absolutely beautiful. If you see here, this is just Dante that is welcomed into Paradise, kind of flying through a landscape. So Dante and Beatrice carried upwards, in a river of light. So I'm going to show you here a very quick YouTube. It's a trailer for the documentary, and I really encourage you to look at it. It's wonderful. Okay, this just to give you an idea that documentary is going to take you to both the Vatican Library as well as to the Berlin Staatliche Museum. Explain how the works came there is going to give you a history on how the manuscript was found in the 19th century in a castle in Scotland, and then was sold at the end of the century. And the interesting thing is that some of the pages made their way to the Vatican, but we're not sure how. So this is one of them. I'm just going to show you another part because it shows you how they're going to...
In an inconspicuous Vatican complex, Botticelli's map of hell is undergoing an unparalleled process. Digital conservation, the foundation for making new discoveries in art history.
So you see how large the piece is.
The scientific scanning of manuscripts means both preservation and dissemination. Something new emerges.
The copies of objects of cultural heritage are...
So I'm going to cut this short because I'm going to give you the references for everything at the bottom, at the end of the presentation. And so you can look at it yourself. It's really worth it. That work is magnificent. And the story is quite compelling. So I have to go on by lack of time now. So we're looking now, after that period, in the early 1490, everything is changing. Lorenzo in 92 dies, and his son is going to inherit, and the power, not the reign, but the power, and the whole atmosphere in Florence is going to change. We now have a revolt against the Medici, some of the excesses, also the fact that Savonarola, that monk, is going to come and really fight against what he thought were the excesses of the Medici, the excess of humanism that was departing people from the church, he thought. And so we'll see how Botticelli is going to change accordingly. So this is one of the pivotal work that he did, showing the coronation of the Virgin with angels and St. John the Evangelist, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, and St. Eulogius. This was commissioned by the Guild of the Goldsmiths, which explains also a lot of gold in the painting. At the bottom of the altarpiece, where again was a predella with different paintings, and I put them on the side here, showing the St. John on the island of Patmos, the Annunciation. This is St. Jerome. Let me see. St. Eligius and a horse, and let me see. Oh, and this is St. John at his desk. So we start seeing a different kind of composition. This is interesting because we will see that that same crown, if you want, on one of the last paintings by Botticelli, and it is geared by actually some of the theater, the real theater that were happening in the churches, where they were had mechanical devices, some of them made by Brunelleschi, that were carrying angels all around in circles during some of that these scenes that were reproduction of what people thought had happened in heaven. I'm coming now to a point where I had shown last time and had some question about is the whole idea of Pietà. We will see that Botticelli is going to make a Pietà, which is a rather odd work. But Pietà, the whole theme of the Pietà, the concept of the Pietà comes from Germany. and was in Germany mostly shown in sculpture. And as you can see, rather odd representation here is the Röntgen Pietà, was made around 1300, and then a slightly later one, I think comes from Poland in 1400, shows the difficulty for a painter to have a mature man on the laps of his mother. He's normally taller, and he's going to, put a child on somebody's laps is fine, but an adult is going to, the dimensions are huge, and makes it very hard for a painter to reconcile the two figures. We'll see that after all, it's Michelangelo in his Pietà that is in St. Peter is going to be, through his genius, able, without shocking us, try to make sense of these two figures together. Here is a lamentation over the dead Christ with Saint by Botticelli that dates to 1490. That is the start of that stylistic change in Botticelli's late work, very striking. So you have Christ lifeless on his mother's lap, and she is herself fallen back in the arms of St. John. The two Marys are supporting the head and the feet of the man, and then you have Mary Magdalene who is crying in the back. St. Jerome, St. Paul, and St. Peter are observing the scene here on the background. And what we find is that these very odd scenes and very compelling scenes are very much in regard of the literature of the time that was really trying to influence the piety and the emotions of people. The same thing here is with that lamentation of the dead Christ, which is a kind of a Pietà. As you can see, he's trying to resolve that problem of the different sizes of the body, and it doesn't work, because if you look at, if the Virgin had to get up, she would be towering over her son. So this is a real difficulty that we find in these representations. But it's really the idea to create feelings of sympathy in him. The Holy Trinity. This is a large altarpiece also. As you can see, by the way, Botticelli always works in tempera. He will never switch to oil. In this particular piece, with the Holy Trinity, you have God the Father, you have the dove representing the Holy Spirit and Christ, and then he's surrounded by Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist. And Mary Magdalene is definitely inspired by the Donatello work on the penitent. The little figures that you see down at the bottom are actually Tobias and the angels, very small, but that could be a reference to the donors. That could be the patron saint of the donors. And Raphael, the angel, was the patron saint of the donors too. The Madonna and Child and the young St. John the Baptist. You see the Virgin handling the Christ child to his young cousin. This is a very affectionate moment. Again, it reflects the emphatic piety of the early 1490s. And we know that this was quite popular because many copies were made of the painting. The Virgin and Child with 3 angels. Again, we have the shape of the tondo and the adaptation for Botticelli to that scene, very pretty, a little bit Filippo Lippi-like representation of the Virgin and Child. This comes to the time of Savonarola, and Savonarola was a Dominican priest and became the leader of Florence from 1494 until his execution in 1498. He really reacted very vehemently against the moral corruption of not only the clergy at the time, and the Pope, Rodrigo Borgia, who was Pope Alexander VI. In 1494, let's see, so in 1494, Charles VIII of France invaded Florence, and the ruling Medici were overthrown, which means Peter. And at that time, Savonarola emerged as the new leader of the city. He became not only the role of the secular leader, but also he remained a priest. He set up a republic in Florence, characterizing it as Christian and religious republic. And one of his first acts was to make sodomy, previously punishable by fine, into a capital offense. Until then, homosexuality had been kind of tolerated by the city. And at that time, many homosexuals from the elite chose to leave Florence. In 1497, he carried out, together with his followers, what is called the bonfire of the vanities. They literally sent out boys from door to door, collecting items associated with moral laxity, mirrors, cosmetic, lewd pictures, pagan books, immoral sculptures, which he wanted to be transformed into statues of saints, gaming tables, chess pieces, musical instrument, fine dresses, women's hats, any kind of thing was all burned on a large pile in the Piazza della Signoria in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. And at that time, a lot of very precious paintings were lost. Some people believe that Sandro Botticelli threw some of his works in the bonfire himself. Tucker. So after a while, people became tired of it. He also, by the way, emphasized the art of dying well, which was quite popular in the North. So we had the French. So in 1497, the population became concerned by what he was doing. And the Pope actually excommunicated him in 1497. He was then arrested and executed in 1498. This was pretty horrible. Him and two of his aides were arrested, were tortured on the rack, though they spared Savonarola's right arm in order that he might be able to sign his confession. You see here a painting showing the Palazzo Vecchio with the procession of Savonarola and his two aides to that fire. They were hung and then burned. Here you can see the enlargement. And there is on the square, by the way, a stone that shows the place where Savonarola was burned. But Savonarola is going to change a lot of things because, including for Botticelli, he's going to be very marked by what happens. And his style becomes really odd and almost much more mystical. So let's see some of the works he did. This is the Calumny of Apellas, made in 94-95, that actually portrays a scene that had been translated by Guarino da Verona, and then also talked about by Alberti in his Della Pictura for emulation. The painters during the Renaissance were really looking at not only the literature of the time, but they knew there were some extremely famous painters during the Greek time, though we have no example of them at all. And one of them, of these great painters, was the painter to Alexander the Great, whose name was Apelles and was considered the biggest painter ever. So the story goes because Apelles had produced a painting that explained this because he was unjustly slandered by a jealous rival who had accused him in front of the gullible king of Egypt, Ptolemy, of being an accomplice in a conspiracy. So after Apellas had been proven to be innocent, he dealt with his rage and desire for revenge by painting this painting. And so in this painting, what Botticelli is doing is reproducing what probably Apellas painted. So what we have in front of us is an innocent man is dragged before the king throne by the personification of calumny. And we have here all the names. So calumny is there. Fraud and envy, malice, fraud, and envy. They are followed to one side by remorse as an old woman, or penitence, depending on how you want to say it, and turning to face the naked truth, who is pointing towards the heaven, as you can see here. The nakedness of truth places her in a relationship with the innocent youth, whose folded hands are also an appeal to a divine power, as you can see down here. This is a small size, so you can see suspicion and ignorance, and then Ptolemy is there, beautiful grisaille, showing that these friezes at the bottom and the top, and then you have all other values around. This is a small size. It's 62 by 91 centimeters. It's not very large, and would be really what you would call a conversation piece. Very classical. So you have some stories. This is Lucian would have been the source, but you have scenes here that tell the story of Nastaggio degli Onesti that we've seen before. He is then going to be asked to paint. This is the story of Virginia. And the next painting will be was supposed to be hung together. These are find a source in the Livy. You have the beautiful, virtuous Virginia becomes the victim of an intrigue of the Appius Claudius, and despite her innocence, is to be condemned to a life of slavery. So in order to avoid that disgrace, she's stabbed to death by her father. And this led to a revolt against Rome's tyrannical decemvirs. The other story shows the story of Lucretia. And there we have the story that while Lucretia, her husband is away, she's raped by Tarquinius, the king's son. And so on the right, we see that she's found unconscious by her husband and his companions. And in order to save her honor, she takes her own life. So these are stories of two heroines of the time. He is also going to be asked to make a series of paintings about Saint Zenobius. In 4 paintings, I'm going to show them rather rapidly. They're less compelling, but these are the kind of work that he is receives commission for. And then past 1500, as we say, his fame is going down. He's struggling in many ways. When he painted Christ crowned with thorns, he's definitely looking at, again, at Flemish painters who were using that iconography quite regularly. There are a couple of versions of that same painting, and you can see the difference between the Flemish realism, total realism, and still that kind of idealism by Botticelli. The Transfiguration, he is definitely not looking so much at perspective, but wants to concentrate on the figure of Christ. This probably is a workshop. He made a couple of paintings on Judith and Holofernes. This is the second one. showing the Jewish heroine holding the head of the general. Though again, there we have a discrepancy in proportions, because him being a man, he would have been quite larger normally than her. The Agony in the Garden. This is actually the only painting that is known to have been exported from Italy during his lifetime and ended up in the possession of Isabella the Catholic in Spain, showing the Agony in the Garden, Christ on an outcrop of a rock, receiving the help of an angel. Again, Adoration of the Magi. This is now a later work. It shows the influence, and this is what we have to understand. By 1500, we have Leonardo, who is coming in and out of Florence. We have Michelangelo, and the style is changing. He's looking at other people's work. Definitely here, he's showing the influence of Leonardo's, though Leonardo never finished that beautiful Adoration of the Magi that I show you here, but there is definitely an influence in the way he spreads people around the effort, and we can feel almost for Botticelli trying to equate the great one. His last painting was probably this one, the Mystical Nativity, and I brought you here actually the design of the mechanics that made this possible. And you can see how we can look back at that other painting we had done, that theatrical imagery that were made literally for these particular spectacles in churches, that for some occasions where they would use these mechanical devices, literally hang people all around, children and others. And this is reproduced then by painters with these beautiful images. Completely different is the presentation of the Virgin there under that roof that if she would stand up, she would go through, because she's so tall compared to the architecture that is there. So there's an unrealistic painting completely. Also interesting, the Botticelli is going to include Latin and Greek text. So you have the angels that carry olive branches. Two of them have presented some olive branches to people at the bottom. You have Joseph kind of almost hiding, and then some much smaller angels here at the front. So it's in contradiction with any sense of perspective. Written in the text is Alessandro painted this picture at the end of the year 1500 in the troubles of Italy, in the half time after the time, according to the 11th chapter of St. John, in the second woe of the Apocalypse, during the release of the devil for 3.5 years. Then he will be chained in the 12th chapter, and we shall see him buried in this picture. That text is very cryptic, and people are still trying to quite understand it. So it's really kind of a prophecy for a revelation. Don't forget, 1500 was a pivotal year. People in 1000 thought that was going to be the end of the world. In 1500, same thing happens. We have Dürer, who is working on his revelation on the apocalypse for the same reason, because it's coming to 1500 and they believe it could become the end of the world. So this is a painting that really is going to haunt Botticelli, and after that he's going to run out of commission because style has changed. I'm going to have to go very quickly through Filippino Lippi, who was born in 1457, son of Fra Filippo Lippi and Lucrezia Butti, completed his apprenticeship in the workshop of Botticelli. He's going to work on the Brancati Chapel, the Strozzi Chapel, the Carafa Chapel in Rome, returned to Florence and died pretty young in 1504. Adoration of the Child, we can see again the influence of Botticelli here in the delicacy of the figures and the idealism. Also, just want to show you how transparent the painting has become. And that's due to over exaggerated cleanings. This is a painting on copper plate, by the way. He is going to be called to finish the Brancati Chapel. You know, Masaccio died very young, couldn't finish it, and he is going to be asked to finish that panel here on the right. So we have started with Masolino and Masaccio. He's supposed to have finished these. They were damaged in the center here because they had pulled the altar and changed the altar, and then attributed to him only are these two scenes that we're going to go see quickly, showing the disputation with Simon Magus and the crucifixion of Peter, and then on the other side, so the crucifixion of Peter, sorry. Some figures can be recognized. We have probably Botticelli here, probably Filippino Lippi there, and Pollaiuolo on the right. And the St. Peter freed from prison. Tondos again, this is the Virgin and Child with Angel. Again, these works would have been set on top of doors, and they were really fashionable. Very gracious style, but he's starting to come into his own style. He takes a little bit from his father and a little bit of Botticelli. Beautiful Annunciation in 2 panels that would have been again above some doors. For St. Altarpiece, interesting, no virgin nor child, but 4 saints. St. Roch, by the way, he probably St. Sebastian there, and one of the forefathers. Signora Altarpiece, the Palazzo, the Pala dell'Iotto, represents the Madonna and Child with Saint John the Baptist, Victor, Bernard, and Zenobius. This was executed for one of the council hall in the Palazzo Vecchio. But we can see the difference with Botticelli, for example. He's using much brighter colors than that, and he's definitely looking at Flemish painting. This is one of his most famous paintings, The Apparition of the Virgin to Saint Bernard. Very interesting. It was completely unreal, but very much inspired by some of Flemish painting of the time. You see the Virgin presenting some of her thoughts to Saint Bernard. Madonna and Child and Saints. Architecture with a landscape at the back. Again, this is very much the type of paintings, contemporary paintings, Flemish paintings at the time, and that opening towards the back is typical of Van der Weyden and then Van Eyck. He is going to be asked to decorate the Strozzi Chapel in Santa Maria Novella, and there he completely departs. This is it's going to work quite a bit of time there, but this is that period where the end of the very classical period of the Renaissance. Beautiful rendering, and as you can see, there is a contrast here at the end of the chapel where you have the stained glass windows with very deep color, and not to compete with it, he goes into grisaille in what surrounds that frame, if you want, except for 2 figures there that represent some of the muses. You can see they carry some masks. They represent tragedy and comedy. And then you have in grisaille Fides, faith, and then on the other side, Caritas. But the decor is becoming completely different. The color used are completely different to what was done before. And we really depart from that very classical period, as I said, of the time of the the central part of the 15th century. And we're moving to what is soon going to become Mannerism. The architecture is enormous. It's looking back at classical architectures, but with a detail that is almost extravagant, and the images, the gesture, the colors that are used are completely different to what was done at that time. So we have, again, he's competing with Leonardo, who is back from Milan. He's competing with Michelangelo, who is back from Rome and fleeing the Pope. And so he's trying to come on in his very own style. Here is the Crucifixion of Sin Philip. You can see the very exaggerated figures and physiognomy of the torturers. St. John the Evangelist resuscitated in Drusiana. Again, look at the architecture, which is going to recall the one of Perugino in Rome, in the Sistine Chapel. But this is inspired as far as the composition by Giotto in the Peruzzi Chapel. The torture of St. John the Evangelist. And then the ceiling. The Carafa Chapel was done in Rome, so for the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and is one of the most decorated chapel that was done in that time. You can see he displays again that horror vacui, that hatred for emptiness. So very heavy architecture, a lot of figures all around. And the grotesque that we talked before, derivated from the grottos. I'm not going to go too much into it because I'm past my time, I know. And here you can see again the influence of these representation in churches. There we have that Annunciation that is part of the same, and there we can still see that influence of Botticelli on him. And here is the vault. The St. Jerome is very interesting, again, quite influenced by Flemish paintings. Beautiful wooded landscape in the background, and the very sculptural representation of St. Jerome completely departs from what Botticelli was doing. Adoration of the Magi, very beautiful scene. The Virgin is very central, follows what Alberti was saying. You have the whole procession that shows you here what's happening. It's actually that multi-story representation where you see the announcement to the Magi, and then they're coming to the Virgin. And this is one of the magnificent drawing by Lippi of that elder man. He's changed the position of the face, but it's definitely him. Meeting at the Golden Gate, that relates to the story from Jacopo da Voragine of the meeting of Joachim and Anne outside the Golden Gate of Jerusalem. Beautiful use of probably what is lapis lazuli, that extraordinary blue pigment, very much in contrast with the very white complexion of the figures in the back that are very Botticellian. Even his signature is gold, in showing Philippinus de Florentia. Some allegories, allegory of music, Erato, the beautiful, very musical representation. You can feel the rhythm in the presentation. The swan, this is probably Leda, which is the Jupiter disguising himself in a swan to approach Leda. And then a very strange instrument into the antler of that deer. You have a harp, kind of a lyra. The marriage of Saint Catherine. He is surrounded by saints. And then his last painting was actually finished by Perugino. As you know, he died young. And in that deposition from the cross, you can really see the mixture of the two styles. And it shows really that very, much more mannerist style that happens at that time, with positions that are unrealistic. We leave the classicism of the Renaissance. Lippi was also a pretty good portrait painter. This is the portrait of a youth that he did in 1485. And then another drawing that I think is extraordinary, the head of an elderly man wearing a cap. He was a great artist, but lived at a time where there were such incredible talents that sometimes he's not always recognized for what he could do. But you've seen also, I think, with Botticelli, a very tortured past that we sometimes ignore because we only see the beauty and the serenity of his mythological works. But this was a very difficult time for Florence. I put you here a few books, at least one book, the Zollner, Frank Zollner, Botticelli, that was done in 2015. Is a pretty good book. Not too many comprehensive books on Botticelli. And then I give you the Botticelli Inferno, which is that documentary. I would really encourage you to see it. I think it brings you into the Vatican Library, it brings you into the Berlin Library, and then tells you the story, which is quite interesting, of how they trace back that manuscript to the Duke of Hamilton in Scotland, of all places. And then the two trailers that I showed you, you can reproduce them too and look at them more in detail. So next time on October 6th, we're going to look Leonardo in Florence and Milan. And I'm now ready to, let me stop the recording.